The Tigray conflict in the north of Ethiopia has seen a rapidly growing humanitarian crisis in the region. The UN says that some 350,000 people are living in famine conditions. The world's most senior humanitarian official, UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark Lowcock, says that behind these numbers lies a brutal human tragedy. Huge numbers of deaths by starvation are unavoidable and indeed already happening. The Ethiopian government has rejected the accusations and claimed that the food shortages are not severe. The UN World Food Programme spokesperson in East Africa, Peter Smurden, spoke to me earlier and began by explaining how the conflict there began between Ethiopia's federal government and the ruling party in the Tigray region in the country's north last September, has since blown up into a full-scale crisis requiring urgent action. Let's begin with how we got here. The G7 are talking about a famine and access for humanitarian aid. Tell us how 7 months ago this area was declared marginally food secure, but now we're using the words famine.
Yes, and the problem is conflict, and that's what's caused this problem across Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. And it started with the government, the federal government, sending in troops because they said there were rebels from the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front attacking them. And the TPLF said it was the other way around. And then more militias and the Eritrean army have come in. And generally the fighting hasn't ended as the government said it would early on, and it's still continuing, and daily there are security incidents, or we are denied access to areas because there's fighting, or we as humanitarian emergency food providers are turned back at roadblocks. So the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse.
All right, we'll talk a little bit about those logistics just now, but I'm just trying to get a sense of just how big this problem is. The UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, talks about 353,000 people in phase 5 and a further 1.7 million people in phase 4. Explain what those phases mean, because these numbers are enormous.
Sure. The 353,000 people that this study by UN and other analysts show as being in catastrophic levels of hunger mean that they're one step from famine. So they are going very hungry. Unless they receive assistance, they will die. And we believe people are already starving. This number is expected to go up to 400,000. In catastrophe phase 5. And we are very concerned that in the coming months, the coming 3 months, the situation will decline unless enough food assistance and other humanitarian assistance gets into these people. And then there may be a full-blown famine. And the famine is a huge step because as we saw in the Somali famine in 2011, the largest number of people who were killed by that famine died before it was declared as a famine. So death rates skyrocket, and that's what we need to stop now.
There seems to be many other things happening at the same time. We hear stories of women being kidnapped and used as sex slaves, and so a lot of women are going in hiding, and as a result are scared to come out and end up actually in this hunger situation.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, some of those women are being fed by WFP at the moment, which is, we're feeding more than 1 million people so far, and we aim to feed 2 million in a few months. But we only see them when they get out of the areas they were stuck in, when they can escape. And they're coming in very poor condition, often with children who are malnourished. And we need to get them back to health as fast as possible because they've been suffering for months in areas where they couldn't go out except at night, where they had to scavenge for anything to eat, and where fighting was ongoing. So what we need is an immediate ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities by all parties to the conflict to allow the people out and to allow our food and other assistance in.
This is an area where people farm, and agriculture has been part of their support system. What's happened to agriculture? Is it been stopped by the conflict, and are soldiers actively stopping people from farming?
It is unclear whether the soldiers are actively trying to stop farmers from farming and are using hunger as a weapon of war, because it's difficult to tell. In many areas there is fighting, and therefore farmers can't go out anyway. But in other areas, what we've seen is that already the situation was bad when the conflict began in November, because that was at the height of the two major cropping seasons, so people couldn't harvest. And now they're supposed to be preparing their land, but there are no fertilizers, there are no seeds, and there is no access to many areas. And it's looking like it's going to be a very poor harvest, which is why that number of those in catastrophe goes up in a few months, and there is the possibility of famine if this continues.
What health issues have you started to see already? I mean, malnourishment is the first line, I guess, when not enough food is on the table. But when there is no food at all, and we're talking about starvation, it gets worse. What sort of things have you witnessed already?
What we're seeing is big numbers of highly malnourished, mainly women and children, who have managed to get out of these areas that were cut off. What we are not seeing yet, but we know is happening, is starvation is happening in those isolated areas, because after all this time, having been sealed off, people will die and are dying of hunger.
And starvation is particularly cruel because the way I understand it is that your body starts eating up its own organs just to survive and to stay alive.
Correct. It's a slow and painful process, and people, after a while, when they are severely malnourished, cannot respond. They are just in pain because their body is being eaten up, and they will not respond to anyone until they get sufficient nutritious food to help them recover, if they ever get it in time.
You talk about the difficulty of access. So is it Ethiopian soldiers, Eritrean soldiers that are stopping humanitarian assistance getting through?
It is armed groups. We're using the term armed groups because we don't want to single one out. It is just armed groups that are stopping us. And that's why there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities, and we need to be allowed into these areas which we cannot reach at the moment.
We're hearing also that these armed groups, as you describe them, sometimes actually steal the food aid from the trucks as they're being offloaded. Is that happening?
We have not had that happen to the United Nations World Food Programme, but there are two other big food operators in Tigray, and we have heard stories like this, and it's possible that it's happening. Certainly, it does happen in conflict situations, but it must stop because it is humanitarian assistance to save civilian lives.
Humanitarians like yourself under threat, I guess. I mean, we had reports as recent as the 28th of May where people were killed. So there is a real danger, even though the humanitarian assistance is clearly visible, clearly marked, but it seems to be getting ignored.
Yes, I mean, it's not getting the credit that it is due, and people are not letting it reach the people who need it most. So that's why we are constantly pressing we and our partners and other organizations, the United Nations as a whole, is pressing all parties to the conflict to allow assistance into areas where it has not been able to reach, because the situation will only get worse in those areas, and we think it's fairly horrific already in many of them.
I suppose without access, this problem could be much bigger than your estimates at this stage. And in a short 7 months, things have gotten really bad. Is this going to deteriorate even more and quicker if nothing is done?
Yes, if nothing is done, it will deteriorate faster and more deeply. But basically, the idea that we may be heading into famine is, according to the analysis, a worst case scenario. It's looking at people continuing to be cut off and us unable to get humanitarian assistance. At the moment, they say that's the worst case scenario, but obviously if the situation worsens, that scenario will come true sooner than later.
The Ethiopian authorities spoke ahead of the G7 summit, and they're trying to play this down. It may be political, or is it that they just don't understand or see the depth of the problem?
I don't know what the motivations of these statements by the government are. They have a presence across Tigray in many areas. There are some areas they are not present in, but they clearly have the resources to know what's going on, and they are, in our opinion, in their public statements, they are playing it down, because that's not the situation they describe, is not the situation we see on the ground in Tigray, and that situation is worsening.